Hey there. Tonight we're not talking about glorious conquests or marble statues, but about something far more unsettling. The slow, grinding collapse of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. For over 1,000 years, Rome seemed invincible. Its legions marched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Its roads connected 3 continents. Its laws governed millions. And then, piece by piece, it all came apart. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions. It didn't collapse because of Christianity. It didn't crumble under economic pressure. Those were symptoms, not causes. The real story of Rome's decline is far stranger, far more complex and far more relevant to our modern world than most people realize. If this kind of deep historical analysis helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you some peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is out there, pondering the mysteries of fallen empires in the quiet hours. So dim the lights, maybe put on some background noise if that helps you focus. Get comfortable. And let's begin with a question that's haunted historians for 15 centuries. Why did the mightiest civilization in human history simply stop? The year is 476 CE. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer has just deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. The irony is almost too perfect. The empire that began with Romulus now ends with another Romulus. This one barely a teenager, powerless and forgotten. Odoacer sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needs an emperor. But here's the thing that should make you pause. Nobody at the time thought this was the end of Rome. Not really. To the people living through it, this was just another change of management. After all, they'd seen plenty of emperors come and go. They'd watched Germanic generals rise to power before. The roads still carried traffic. The aqueducts still brought water. Latin was still spoken. Roman law was still enforced. So when exactly did Rome fall? Was it 476? Was it 410 when Alaric sacked the city? Was it 1453 when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans? Or did it never really fall at all, but transform into something unrecognizable? The traditional narrative goes something like this. Rome grew too big. Barbarians pressed on the borders. The economy collapsed. Christianity weakened military virtue. Corrupt emperors squandered resources. Eventually, the whole thing came crashing down like a house of cards. It's a neat story. It's also mostly wrong. Let me tell you what really happened. But first, we need to understand what Rome actually was by the time it started to fall. Because the Rome of Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century looked nothing like the Rome of Romulus in the 8th century BCE, and the Rome of Constantine in the 4th century CE was something else entirely. By the height of the empire under Trajan, Rome controlled roughly 2.5 million square miles. That's larger than the continental United States. It stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern England to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt. From the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Euphrates River in modern Iraq. Within these borders lived perhaps 70 million people, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, following countless local customs. Holding this together wasn't just a matter of military might, though the legions certainly mattered. It required an intricate web of administration, law, trade, culture, and identity that had taken centuries to develop. Roman citizenship meant something. Roman law provided a framework for justice that people actually trusted. Roman engineering made daily life better in ways both obvious and subtle. But empires aren't static things. They're living organisms that must constantly adapt or die. And by the 3rd century, the pressures on this vast system were becoming unbearable. The crisis began, as these things often do, with success. Rome had grown so large that it could no longer be effectively governed by the old republican institutions, even modified by Augustus's principate. The emperor was supposed to be everywhere at once, defending the Rhine frontier, while simultaneously campaigning on the Danube, managing affairs in Syria while keeping an eye on Britain. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he broke the pattern of adoptive succession that had given Rome 5 good emperors in a row. Instead, he left the throne to his biological son, Commodus. It was a decision that would have consequences no one could foresee. Commodus was, to put it mildly, unsuited for imperial responsibility. He preferred gladiatorial combat to governance, charging the treasury enormous sums for his staged appearances in the arena. He renamed Rome after himself and claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules. When he was finally strangled in his bath by his own wrestling partner, it set off a chain reaction that would shake the empire to its foundations. What followed was something unprecedented in Roman history. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own household troops, literally auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won this grotesque lottery, but his reign lasted only 66 days. Provincial armies, disgusted by events in Rome, proclaimed their own candidates. This was the moment when something fundamental broke in the Roman system. For the first time, multiple armies were marching on Rome simultaneously, each supporting a different claimant to the throne. The winner, Septimius Severus, had to fight a series of civil wars to establish his authority. His dying advice to his sons was telling: enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. The 3rd century crisis that followed makes our modern political upheavals look like playground squabbles. Over 50 years, at least 26 different men claimed the imperial title. Most ruled for just a few years, sometimes a few months, before meeting violent ends. The imperial office, once a position of unquestioned authority, became a death sentence. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't just political chaos, it was systemic breakdown. Each time a new emperor took power, he had to reward his supporters and eliminate his enemies. This meant constant purges, property confiscations, and currency debasements to pay for loyalty. The stable institutions that had held the empire together for centuries were being consumed from within. Meanwhile, external pressures were mounting. Germanic tribes, possibly pushed westward by population movements deeper in Europe and Asia, began testing Roman frontiers in unprecedented numbers. In the east, a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, proved more aggressive than their Parthian predecessors. The empire that had once expanded seemingly without limit now found itself fighting for survival on multiple fronts. The Emperor Decius became the first Roman ruler to die in battle against foreign enemies when Gothic forces killed him at Abritus. His successor, Valerian, suffered an even worse fate, captured alive by the Persian king Shapur and allegedly used as a human footstool before being skinned after death. As central authority collapsed, the empire began to fragment. In the west, a Gallic empire broke away, encompassing modern France, Britain, and parts of Spain. In the east, the desert city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia established control over provinces from Egypt to Asia Minor. For a moment, it seemed the Roman world might shatter completely, yet somehow it didn't. This is where the story gets interesting, because Rome's survival through the 3rd century crisis reveals something profound about the nature of civilizations. They're far more resilient than they appear, but they're also more fragile than anyone wants to admit. The turning point came with a series of soldier emperors who gradually restored order through a combination of military skill and administrative reform. Claudius Gothicus earned his title by decisively defeating Gothic invaders in the Balkans. Aurelian reunified the empire by conquering both the Gallic usurpers and Palmyra, earning the title Restorer of the World. But the empire they restored was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the crisis. The old Augustan settlement, with its careful balance of republican forms and imperial power, was gone forever. In its place stood a more openly autocratic system where the emperor was increasingly seen as a remote, sacred figure rather than first citizen. This transformation culminated with Diocletian, who took the unprecedented step of dividing imperial authority among 4 rulers. His tetrarchy system recognized what had become obvious. The empire was simply too large and complex for one person to manage effectively. He separated civil and military authority, reorganized provincial boundaries, and implemented new tax systems to support the expanded bureaucracy and army. Diocletian's reforms stabilized the empire, but at a cost. The free market economy of the early empire gave way to a more regulated system, where the state's needs took precedence over individual initiative. Hereditary occupations became mandatory for certain vital professions. The distinction between rich and poor became more pronounced, with different legal standards applied to each class. Perhaps most significantly, Diocletian launched what became known as the Great Persecution against Christians. This final attempt to suppress the new religion proved counterproductive, creating martyrs and strengthening Christian resolve rather than eliminating the faith. When Constantine came to power after a series of civil wars following Diocletian's retirement, he made a decision that would reshape the Roman world forever. Whether motivated by genuine conversion or political calculation, Constantine embraced Christianity, ending centuries of persecution and beginning the empire's transformation into a Christian state. Constantine's other momentous decision was founding a new capital at Constantinople. This new Rome on the Bosporus would serve as the Eastern Empire's center for over 1,000 years, but it also formalized a division that would prove permanent. The Roman world now had 2 capitals, 2 administrations, and increasingly, 2 different destinies. By this point, you might be wondering, if Rome survived the 3rd century crisis, if it reformed and adapted, if it even found a new lease on life under Constantine, then what actually caused its fall? The answer is that it didn't fall exactly. It transformed, evolved, and gradually became something else. The Western Roman Empire that Oudoacer dissolved in 476 was already a very different creature from the empire of Augustus or even Diocletian. Its emperors controlled little beyond Italy itself. Germanic kingdoms had established effective independence in former provinces. The imperial office had become largely ceremonial, a puppet show performed for an audience that had long since stopped paying attention. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire continued to flourish from Constantinople. Its emperors still considered themselves the legitimate rulers of the entire Roman world, including the lost Western provinces. This Eastern continuation would survive for another 1,000 years, adapting repeatedly to new challenges while maintaining an unbroken connection to ancient Rome. So here's the first unsettling truth about Rome's fall. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation that took centuries. The empire didn't die. It evolved into something unrecognizable. The barbarians who supposedly destroyed Rome often tried harder to preserve Roman institutions than the Romans themselves. But this raises an even more disturbing question. If Rome didn't really fall, if it just slowly changed into something else, how would we know if the same thing were happening to our own civilization? How do you recognize the end of a world when it comes not with a bang, but with a whisper? That's what we'll explore next. Because the real lesson of Rome's decline isn't about ancient history. It's about how civilizations transform, adapt, and sometimes lose themselves in the process of survival. And once you understand how that happened to Rome, you start to see the patterns everywhere. The symptoms we think of as causing Rome's fall were actually signs of a much deeper transformation. Military troubles, economic pressures, political instability, cultural changes. These weren't the disease. They were just how the disease manifested itself. The real question is what was happening beneath the surface, in the invisible structures that held Roman civilization together. And that story, the untold story of why Rome really fell, is both more complex and more relevant than anything you'll find in the standard histories. Because Rome's transformation didn't end in 476. In many ways, it's still continuing today. What killed Rome wasn't an army or a plague or a barbarian horde. It was something far more insidious. It was the slow erosion of the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. And that erosion began long before the last emperor fell. Picture this. You're a Roman citizen living in Gaul in the year 400. Your grandfather fought in the legions, spoke Latin with pride, sent his taxes to Rome without question. He believed in Roman law, Roman gods, Roman destiny. But you? You've never seen Rome. You've never met a Roman official who wasn't Germanic. Your local governor is a Frankish warlord who calls himself a Roman patrician, but rules like a tribal chief. Your taxes still get collected, but they go to local strongmen, not distant emperors. Your disputes are still settled by law, but it's a strange hybrid of Roman legal principles and Germanic customs that would puzzle your grandfather. You still call yourself a Roman citizen, but what does that even mean anymore? This is the untold story of Rome's fall. Not conquest, but assimilation in reverse. The empire didn't get destroyed by barbarians. It got absorbed by them. And the Romans, desperate to maintain some semblance of order, helped it happen. Here's how it worked. When Germanic tribes first crossed Roman frontiers in significant numbers, they didn't come as conquerors. They came as refugees, fleeing the Huns who were pressing westward from the Asian steppes. These weren't savage raiders looking to burn and pillage. They were entire peoples, families and children, looking for safety and better land. Rome had dealt with situations like this before. The standard solution was to settle these groups as foederati, allied troops who would defend frontier regions in exchange for land and Roman recognition. It seemed like a win-win arrangement. Rome got defenders for distant provinces. The Germanic peoples got security and a chance to improve their lives. But something different happened this time. The numbers were too large, the pressure too sustained. And Rome's capacity to absorb and Romanize newcomers had been fatally weakened by the 3rd century crisis. In the old days, becoming Roman meant something. It meant access to Roman courts, Roman law, Roman opportunities. It meant your children could rise in the world through military service or civil administration. It meant joining a civilization that was clearly superior to anything else available. By the 4th and 5th centuries, that wasn't necessarily true anymore. Germanic chieftains already had access to Roman military commands. They married into Roman aristocratic families. They accumulated Roman titles and Roman wealth. But they did it while maintaining their own cultural identity, their own followers, their own power base. The result was a hybrid elite that called itself Roman, but operated according to Germanic principles. These men spoke Latin in public, and their native tongues in private. They wore Roman dress at court, and Germanic armor in battle. They paid lip service to Roman law, while settling disputes through personal relationships and tribal loyalties. What made this transformation so effective was that it happened gradually, almost invisibly. There was no moment when someone announced that Rome was ending and something else was beginning. Instead, there were thousands of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time. A Germanic general is given command of a Roman army. Makes sense. He's proven his loyalty and skill. A Germanic king is granted the title of patrician and allowed to rule his territory as a Roman province. Practical solution to a difficult situation. Germanic law is permitted alongside Roman law for cases involving Germanic settlers. Seems fair. They have their own customs after all. Each decision was logical. Each compromise was necessary, but the cumulative effect was revolutionary. Within a few generations, the Roman state in the West had become a Germanic confederation that happened to use Roman titles and maintain Roman ceremonies. The Eastern Empire watched this transformation with growing alarm, but they faced their own version of the same pressures. They managed to maintain more centralized control, partly through geography and partly through more ruthless policies toward potential rivals. But even in Constantinople, the empire was becoming something its founders wouldn't have recognized. Christianity played a crucial role in this transformation, though not in the way most people think. The rise of Christian emperors didn't weaken Rome militarily or morally. Instead, it provided a new framework for imperial authority that could transcend ethnic and cultural boundaries. A Germanic king could become a defender of the faith just as easily as a Roman aristocrat. Christian bishops could provide legitimacy to new rulers regardless of their tribal origins. The church became a bridge between the Roman past and the post-Roman future, preserving some elements of classical civilization while adapting to new realities. But this religious transformation came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Traditional Roman civic virtues, the values that had built the Republic and sustained the early empire, didn't translate well into Christian categories. The old Roman emphasis on public service, civic duty, and collective achievement gave way to more individualistic concerns about personal salvation and spiritual purity. This shift had profound political consequences. In traditional Roman culture, military service was a civic obligation and a path to honor. Wealth was meant to be displayed through public works that benefited the community. Political office was a responsibility that came with expectations of personal sacrifice for the common good. By the 5th century, these values were fading. Military service became the province of professionals and foreigners. Wealth was increasingly hoarded privately or donated to churches, rather than invested in public infrastructure. Political office became a prize to be won, rather than a burden to be shouldered. The result was a gradual hollowing out of the civic institutions that had made Roman governance possible. The forms remained, but the spirit that animated them was gone. Senators still met, but they represented narrow aristocratic interests rather than broader public concerns. Magistrates still held office, but they served wealthy patrons rather than abstract principles of justice. This institutional decay was masked for a while by the continued functioning of the imperial bureaucracy. The Roman administrative system was so well developed that it could run almost automatically, requiring minimal input from the top. Tax collection continued, laws were enforced, public services functioned, all without much direction from emperors who were increasingly powerless figureheads. But bureaucracies, however efficient, can't provide vision or inspiration. They can maintain existing systems, but struggle to adapt to new challenges. And the challenges facing the late Roman world required more than administrative competence. They demanded fundamental rethinking of how society should be organized. The economic pressures that historians often cite as causes of Rome's fall were really symptoms of this deeper institutional failure. The empire's finances were strained not because of external military threats, but because the tax base was eroding as local strongmen carved out autonomous territories. Trade networks that had once connected the Mediterranean world began fragmenting as political authority became localized. The famous Roman roads still carried traffic, but increasingly it was regional rather than imperial commerce. Cities that had flourished as nodes in a vast economic network found themselves reduced to local market towns. Currency systems that had provided stability for centuries began breaking down as different regions developed their own monetary arrangements. The gold solidus continued to circulate, but alongside it appeared dozens of local currencies issued by Germanic kings, church authorities, and city governments. None of these changes happened overnight. None were the result of deliberate policy decisions. They emerged organically as people adapted to changing circumstances, making practical choices that seemed reasonable in the short term, but had revolutionary implications when viewed across generations. The military transformation followed a similar pattern. The Roman legions didn't disappear in a single catastrophic defeat. They evolved gradually into something that retained the Roman name while operating according to very different principles. Professional soldiers increasingly came from outside the traditional Roman recruiting grounds. Germanic warriors brought their own weapons, tactics, and command structures. They served under Roman banners and took Roman titles, but their primary loyalty was to their immediate commanders rather than to abstract concepts of Roman duty. The result was an army that was still called Roman, but functioned more like a collection of tribal warbands held together by personal relationships and immediate material interests. This force could be effective in specific circumstances, but it lacked the systematic training, standardized equipment, and unified command structure that had made the classical legions so formidable. More importantly, this new military couldn't serve the broader political function that the legions had traditionally fulfilled. The classical Roman army had been a school of citizenship, a way of integrating diverse populations into a common identity. Soldiers learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, and developed loyalty to Roman institutions that lasted long after their service ended. The late Roman military produced no such integration. Germanic warriors remained Germanic. They fought for personal advancement and tribal honor rather than imperial glory. When their immediate interests conflicted with broader Roman concerns, they had no compelling reason to choose Rome. This military transformation both reflected and accelerated the broader cultural changes that were reshaping the Roman world. As the army became less Roman, so did the empire it was supposed to defend. As imperial authority became more dependent on Germanic supporters, it inevitably took on Germanic characteristics. The process was irreversible once it reached a certain point. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a Germanic confederation in all but name. The final deposition of Romulus Augustulus was just the formal recognition of a transformation that had been decades in the making. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. None of the people involved understood what they were participating in. The Germanic kings who took Roman titles genuinely believed they were preserving Roman traditions. The Roman aristocrats who allied with Germanic strongmen thought they were adapting to temporary circumstances. The bureaucrats who served successive puppet emperors imagined they were maintaining institutional continuity. Everyone was acting rationally based on the information available to them. Everyone was making reasonable compromises in the face of immediate pressures. And yet the cumulative result was the disappearance of a civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years. This is the real lesson of Rome's fall. Civilizations don't usually die from external shocks. They die from internal transformations that happen so gradually that nobody notices until it's too late. They die when the people within them stop believing in the values and institutions that made them possible in the first place. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. Rome destroyed itself by trying to accommodate pressures it was no longer strong enough to resist. And the most terrifying part of this story is how familiar it sounds when you look around at our own world today. The transformation wasn't just political or military. It reached into the very soul of what it meant to be Roman. Walk through any major city in the late Empire, and you'd see the change everywhere, though you might not recognize it at first glance. The forums were still there, those great public spaces where citizens had once gathered to debate, trade, and participate in civic life. But now they were quieter. The merchants who set up stalls were increasingly foreigners. The languages you heard weren't just Latin anymore, but a babel of Germanic dialects, Celtic tongues, and Eastern languages brought by traders and settlers. The basilicas still functioned as courts and meeting halls, but the law being administered inside them was becoming something hybrid. Roman legal principles mixed with Germanic customs, creating a patchwork system that worked well enough for daily disputes, but lacked the systematic coherence that had made Roman law legendary. The temples were the most obvious change. Many had been abandoned or converted to Christian churches. Others stood empty, their priestly colleges disbanded, their rituals forgotten. The old gods who had protected Rome for centuries were being replaced by a new deity, whose followers often seemed more concerned with the next world than this one. But the most subtle transformation was in the people themselves. The Roman citizen of the 5th century looked and sounded Roman, carried Roman names, claimed Roman heritage. Yet something fundamental had shifted in how they understood themselves and their place in the world. In the early empire, being Roman meant belonging to something larger than yourself, larger even than your family or tribe. It meant participating in a civilization that spanned continents, that had tamed the Mediterranean and brought order to chaos. Roman identity was expansive, confident, forward-looking. By the late empire, that confidence was gone. Romans had become defensive, inward-looking, nostalgic for a golden age that seemed increasingly distant. They still claimed superiority over the barbarians, but it was the hollow superiority of people who knew their best days were behind them. This psychological shift manifested in countless small ways. Roman literature became obsessed with decline and decay. Roman art turned from celebrating imperial achievements to commemorating past glories. Roman education focused less on training future leaders than on preserving ancient knowledge that seemed in danger of being lost. The very language was changing. The elegant, precise Latin of Cicero and Virgil was giving way to something rougher, more colloquial, heavily influenced by the speech patterns of non-Roman populations. Scholars still wrote in classical style, but the Latin spoken in the streets was evolving into what would eventually become the Romance languages. These linguistic changes weren't just about vocabulary and grammar. They reflected deeper shifts in how people thought about the world. Classical Latin had been designed for administration, for law, for the precise communication needed to govern a vast empire. The emerging vernaculars were more suited to local concerns, family relationships, immediate practical needs. The educational system that had once produced generations of capable administrators was also breaking down. The old schools that taught rhetoric, philosophy, and practical skills were increasingly replaced by church institutions focused on theological training. Literacy rates, which had been relatively high in urban areas during the early empire, began declining as the classical curriculum became less relevant to daily life. This educational transformation had profound consequences for imperial administration. The bureaucracy that had held the empire together depended on a steady supply of educated Romans who could read, write, calculate, and think systematically about complex problems. As that supply dwindled, the administration became increasingly dependent on Germanic allies who often lacked these skills. The result was a gradual dumbing down of imperial governance. Complex policies gave way to simple solutions. Long-term planning became impossible when administrators struggled with basic literacy. The sophisticated legal and financial systems that had made Roman rule effective slowly simplified into cruder arrangements that local strongmen could understand and implement. Economic life followed a similar pattern of decay and transformation. The Mediterranean-wide trading networks that had connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, didn't collapse overnight. They fragmented gradually as political authority became localized and transportation became less secure. Roman merchants had once traveled freely throughout the empire, protected by Roman law and Roman legions. Their successors faced a patchwork of local authorities, each with their own customs, currencies, and regulations. Long-distance trade became more expensive and risky, while local markets became more important. The cities that had been the glory of Roman civilization began to shrink. Not dramatically at first, just a gradual thinning as people moved to the countryside or to smaller towns that seemed safer and more manageable. The grand public buildings fell into disrepair as tax revenues declined and civic pride faded. Rome itself, the eternal city, became a shadow of its former self. The population that had once reached perhaps 1 million people dwindled to maybe 50,000 by the end of the 5th century. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Aqueducts broke down and weren't repaired. The great forums filled with weeds and rubble, yet even in decline, Rome retained its symbolic power. Germanic kings who ruled from Ravenna or Milan still claimed to govern in Rome's name. They issued coins with Roman inscriptions, granted Roman titles, maintained the fiction that they were preserving rather than replacing imperial authority. This symbolic persistence of Roman identity, even as Roman reality disappeared, is perhaps the strangest aspect of the entire transformation. People continued to call themselves Romans long after the Roman state had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. They preserved Roman ceremonies, Roman holidays, Roman legal forms, even as these became increasingly empty rituals. The Church played a crucial role in this preservation of Roman forms. Christian bishops had often been educated in classical schools before their conversion. They understood the value of Roman administrative techniques and legal principles. They also recognized that Roman prestige could legitimize their own authority. So the Church became a bridge between the Roman past and the post-Roman future. It preserved Latin as a sacred language, maintained schools that taught classical texts, and provided a framework for governance that transcended tribal boundaries. But it also transformed these Roman elements, giving them new meanings and purposes that their creators never intended. Christian Rome was still Rome, but it was a very different kind of Rome. The emphasis shifted from worldly achievement to spiritual salvation, from collective glory to individual piety, from military conquest to peaceful conversion. These weren't necessarily worse values, but they were incompatible with the civic culture that had made the classical empire possible. The transformation accelerated during the 5th century as external pressures mounted. The Hunnic Confederation under Attila forced massive population movements that brought new waves of Germanic peoples across Roman frontiers. The Vandal conquest of North Africa deprived the Western Empire of crucial tax revenues. Persian wars in the East drained resources that might have been used to defend the West. But these external shocks were manageable individually. Rome had faced worse crises before and survived. What made the 5th century different was that the empire no longer had the internal coherence needed to respond effectively to multiple challenges simultaneously. Previous crises had been resolved by emperors who could rally the entire imperial system behind a common response. Marcus Aurelius had mobilized resources from across the empire to defend the Danube frontier. Septimius Severus had drawn on provincial armies to restore order after civil war. Diocletian had implemented empire-wide reforms to address systemic problems. The 5th century empire couldn't do this anymore. Regional strongmen pursued their own interests rather than imperial needs. Germanic allies prioritized tribal concerns over Roman strategy. The Eastern and Western courts increasingly worked at cross purposes rather than in coordination. The result was a series of piecemeal responses to comprehensive challenges. Individual problems were addressed, but the underlying weaknesses that made these problems possible were never confronted. It was like trying to repair a crumbling building by fixing individual bricks while ignoring the fact that the foundation was giving way. The final collapse in the West came not from any single catastrophic event, but from the accumulated weight of countless small failures. Each compromise weakened the system a little more. Each accommodation to Germanic demands reduced Roman authority a little further. Each generation of Romans grew a little less Roman than the one before. By the time Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the act was almost anticlimactic. The imperial office had become so meaningless that its elimination hardly mattered. Real power had long since passed to Germanic kings, who ruled in their own names rather than as Roman officials. The Eastern Empire survived this transformation because it faced different pressures and made different choices. Constantinople was more defensible than Rome. The eastern provinces were wealthier and more urbanized. The Eastern emperors were more successful at playing Germanic groups against each other rather than accommodating them. But even the Eastern Empire was transformed by the crisis. The Byzantine state that emerged from the 6th century wars of reconquest bore little resemblance to the classical Roman Empire. It was more centralized, more militarized, more explicitly Christian. It preserved Roman legal traditions and imperial titles, but the culture and society were fundamentally different. The real tragedy of Rome's fall wasn't the loss of territory or population, it was the loss of possibility. The Roman Empire at its height had represented something unprecedented in human history, a cosmopolitan civilization that could incorporate diverse peoples into a common framework while allowing them to maintain their distinct identities. This wasn't perfect by any means. Roman rule could be brutal and exploitative. Roman society was deeply hierarchical and often unjust. But the Roman model offered a vision of human organization that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries, that made citizenship a matter of law rather than blood, that created space for different cultures to coexist and contribute to a larger whole. When that vision died, the Mediterranean world fragmented into smaller, more exclusive communities. Germanic kingdoms were more ethnically homogeneous than the Roman Empire had been. Christian communities were more religiously uniform. Local strongmen commanded more personal loyalty, but provided less systematic justice. The medieval world that emerged from Rome's ashes had its own virtues and achievements, but it took centuries to redevelop the cosmopolitan outlook and systematic governance that Rome had provided. In some ways, we're still trying to recreate what Rome accomplished and then lost. This is why Rome's fall remains relevant today. We live in another age of global integration, another time when diverse peoples are trying to create common institutions while maintaining their distinct identities. We face similar challenges of scale, similar pressures to accommodate rather than integrate, similar temptations to preserve forms while abandoning substance. The lesson of Rome isn't that such attempts are doomed to fail. The Roman Empire lasted longer than any comparable political system before or since. But Rome's example does show how civilizations can decay from within, even when they appear successful from the outside, how gradual compromises can accumulate into revolutionary changes, how the very flexibility that allows a system to survive in the short term can undermine its long-term viability. Rome fell because Romans stopped believing in Rome. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and almost imperceptibly. They kept the names and ceremonies while abandoning the principles and practices that had made those names and ceremonies meaningful. The barbarians who supposedly conquered Rome were often more Roman than the Romans themselves. They wanted to join the empire, not destroy it. They adopted Roman titles, Roman law, Roman customs. But in doing so, they transformed these Roman elements into something else. Something that preserved the appearance of continuity while representing fundamental discontinuity. This is how civilizations really die, not from external conquest, but from internal transformation. Not from dramatic collapse, but from gradual erosion. Not from rejection of their values, but from the slow redefinition of what those values mean, until they mean something entirely different. The question that should haunt us is whether we would recognize such a transformation if it were happening to our own civilization. Would we notice if our institutions were being hollowed out from within? Would we see the danger if our values were being gradually redefined beyond recognition? Would we understand what we were losing if the changes happened slowly enough to seem normal? Rome's fall teaches us that civilizations are more fragile than they appear, but also more resilient than we might expect. The Roman Empire ended, but Roman influence continued through law, language, religion, and countless other channels. What died wasn't Rome itself, but a particular way of being Roman. The question for us is what kind of transformation we're willing to accept, and what kind of continuity we're determined to preserve. Because change is inevitable. The only choice is whether we guide that change consciously or let it happen to us unconsciously, the way it happened to Rome. And that choice, more than any external threat or internal weakness, will determine whether our civilization survives in a form we would recognize or transforms into something that future historians will mark as the end of one world and the beginning of another. The story of Rome's fall is really the story of how civilizations change, how they adapt, and how they sometimes lose themselves in the process of trying to survive. It's a story that's still being written, in our time and in our choices, every day. The parallels become unsettling when you start looking closely. Consider what happened to Roman identity in the provinces during those final centuries. A man living in Gaul around 450 might carry a Roman name, hold Roman citizenship, live under Roman law. But his neighbors were Frankish warriors who'd been granted land by a Germanic king who claimed Roman authority. His children learned Latin in school, but spoke Frankish at home. His wife wore Roman dress, but followed Germanic customs. This wasn't replacement, it was absorption. And the Romans themselves, desperate to maintain order, facilitated every step of the process. They gave Germanic chiefs Roman titles because it seemed to legitimize their authority. They allowed Germanic law to operate alongside Roman law because it seemed practical. They recruited Germanic soldiers into Roman armies because they needed the manpower. Each decision made perfect sense at the time. Each compromise solved an immediate problem. But the cumulative effect was revolutionary. Within a few generations, being Roman meant something completely different than it had meant to their grandparents. The erosion happened in layers, like sediment building up in a riverbed. First came the practical accommodations. Germanic peoples needed land. Romans needed defenders. Simple exchange. Then came the cultural mixing, intermarriage between Roman aristocrats and Germanic nobles. Children who grew up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable in both worlds, but fully committed to neither. The legal system adapted next. Roman law was sophisticated but rigid. Germanic customs were flexible but inconsistent. The hybrid that emerged kept Roman forms while incorporating Germanic principles. Disputes were still settled in courts, but the law being applied was something new, something that neither Cicero nor any tribal elder would have recognized. Religious transformation followed a different but parallel path. Christianity provided a bridge between Roman and Germanic cultures, but it also changed both. Roman Christians adopted the organizational skills and legal thinking of the empire. Germanic Christians brought their own traditions of personal loyalty and warrior culture. The result was a church that was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic, but something unprecedented. The military changes were perhaps the most visible. The disciplined ranks of the classical legions gave way to more flexible formations that could accommodate different fighting styles. Germanic warriors brought their own weapons and tactics. Roman officers learned to work with Germanic chiefs. The army remained effective, but it was no longer recognizably Roman. What made this transformation so complete was that it happened simultaneously at every level of society. The imperial court adopted Germanic customs to better manage Germanic allies. The aristocracy intermarried with Germanic nobles to secure their positions. The middle classes learned Germanic languages to conduct business. Even the common people found themselves living in communities where Roman and Germanic elements blended together. The process was self-reinforcing. As Romans became more Germanic, Germanics became more Roman. But the synthesis wasn't balanced. Germanic military culture was ascending, while Roman civic culture was declining. Germanic personal loyalty was replacing Roman institutional loyalty. Germanic tribalism was overwhelming Roman universalism. The economic transformation followed the same pattern. Roman commerce had been based on long-distance trade, standardized currency, and imperial protection. As imperial authority fragmented, trade networks became localized. Different regions developed their own currencies. Merchants had to negotiate with multiple authorities, each with their own customs and regulations. This wasn't collapse in the dramatic sense. Markets still functioned, goods still moved, people still made livings. But the integrated Mediterranean economy that had been Rome's greatest achievement was breaking apart into smaller, more isolated systems. The barbarians didn't destroy Roman commerce. They adapted it to their own needs and capabilities. Urban life changed in similar ways. Cities remained important, but their role shifted. Instead of being nodes in an empire-wide network, they became regional centers, serving local hinterlands. Instead of being governed by Roman magistrates, they were ruled by Germanic nobles, who might hold Roman titles, but operated according to their own traditions. The physical transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Roman buildings were maintained but often modified for new purposes. Temples became churches or storehouses. Basilicas were subdivided into smaller spaces. Forums were built over or converted to markets that served different communities with different needs. What's striking is how little resistance this transformation encountered. You might expect Romans to fight desperately to preserve their civilization. Instead, most seem to embrace the changes, or at least accept them as inevitable. Why? Part of the answer lies in the 3rd century crisis we discussed earlier. That catastrophic period had shattered Roman confidence. The empire that had seemed eternal had nearly collapsed completely. The institutions that had seemed unshakable had proven fragile. The identity that had seemed unquestionable had been called into doubt. Romans of the 4th and 5th centuries had grown up hearing stories of chaos, civil war, and near destruction. They had learned to value stability above purity, survival above principle. When Germanic allies offered security in exchange for accommodation, many Romans saw it as a reasonable bargain. There was also a practical element. The Germanic peoples settling in Roman territories weren't savage destroyers. They were often more disciplined and organized than the Romans themselves. They maintained order, collected taxes, enforced laws. They provided the services that imperial government was supposed to provide, but increasingly couldn't. From a Roman perspective, it often looked like the barbarians were saving Roman civilization rather than destroying it. Germanic kings preserved Roman legal forms, maintained Roman administrative structures, protected Roman trade routes. The fact that they were transforming these institutions in the process wasn't immediately obvious. The psychological aspect was equally important. Many Romans had lost faith in their own culture. The old gods had failed to protect the empire. The old virtues seemed inadequate to new challenges. The old certainties had been shattered by repeated crises. Christianity offered new sources of meaning and identity, but Christian Romans often felt more kinship with Christian Germans than with pagan Romans. Religious identity was becoming more important than ethnic or political identity. The community of believers was replacing the community of citizens. This spiritual transformation had profound political consequences. Roman civic culture had been based on the idea that citizens owed primary loyalty to the state. Christian culture emphasized loyalty to God, to the church, to the community of believers. These loyalties weren't necessarily incompatible with Roman citizenship, but they took precedence over it. Germanic culture offered something that late Roman culture increasingly lacked: a sense of personal honor and direct relationships. In a world where imperial institutions seemed distant and unreliable, the Germanic emphasis on face-to-face loyalty between warriors and chiefs had obvious appeal. The result was a gradual shift in how people understood authority and obligation. Instead of abstract duty to the state, personal loyalty to individual leaders. Instead of universal law applied equally, customary arrangements based on personal relationships. Instead of bureaucratic administration, household management extended to larger territories. None of these changes were necessarily worse than what they replaced. Germanic law could be more flexible and responsive than Roman law. Germanic leadership could be more personal and accessible than Roman bureaucracy. Germanic communities could be more cohesive and supportive than Roman cities. But they were different. And the cumulative effect of these differences was to create a society that retained Roman names and forms while operating according to completely different principles. This wasn't conquest. It was metamorphosis. The linguistic evidence tells the same story. Latin didn't disappear in the former Western provinces. It evolved into the Romance languages that are still spoken today. But the Latin of the 6th century was very different from the Latin of the 1st century. It had absorbed Germanic vocabulary, Germanic grammar patterns, Germanic ways of thinking about the world. This linguistic evolution paralleled the cultural transformation. People still called themselves Romans and spoke Latin, but both identity and language had been fundamentally altered by contact with Germanic cultures. The continuity was real, but so was the change. Legal documents from the period show the same pattern. They're written in Latin, they follow Roman legal forms, they cite Roman precedents. But the underlying concepts of law, justice, and social organization are increasingly Germanic. The forms preserved, while the substance transformed. Religious texts reveal similar adaptations. Christian writers of the 5th and 6th centuries used classical Latin literary techniques and cited Roman authors. But their understanding of society, government, and human relationships reflected Germanic as much as Roman influences. They were creating a synthesis that was genuinely new. Archaeological evidence confirms what the written sources suggest. Roman-style buildings continued to be constructed, but with modifications that reflected new uses and new inhabitants. Germanic artifacts appear alongside Roman ones in the same archaeological layers, suggesting cultural mixing rather than replacement. The burial practices are particularly revealing. Roman customs of cremation and urban cemeteries gave way to Germanic practices of inhumation and rural burial grounds. But the grave goods often include both Roman and Germanic objects, suggesting that the deceased inhabited both cultural worlds simultaneously. This material evidence of cultural synthesis supports the argument that Rome's transformation was gradual and collaborative rather than sudden and violent. The barbarians didn't sweep away Roman civilization. They absorbed it, adapted it, and ultimately transformed it into something new. The process was so gradual that many people probably didn't recognize it as a fundamental change. Each generation made small adjustments to accommodate new circumstances. Each compromise seemed reasonable and temporary. The cumulative effect only became apparent in retrospect. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Rome's transformation. It happened with minimal resistance because most people didn't understand what they were participating in. They thought they were preserving Roman civilization by adapting it to new conditions. They didn't realize they were replacing it with something fundamentally different. The Germanic kings who took Roman titles genuinely believed they were continuing the empire. The Roman aristocrats who allied with them thought they were maintaining their positions within the existing system. The church officials who blessed these arrangements imagined they were Christianizing barbarians rather than barbarizing Christians. Everyone was acting rationally based on their immediate circumstances. Everyone was trying to preserve what they valued most. But the collective result of all these rational individual decisions was the end of the civilization they were trying to save. This pattern of well-intentioned transformation leading to unintended consequences appears repeatedly throughout history. It's visible in the decline of the Byzantine Empire, where Greek identity gradually replaced Roman identity, even as the state claimed continuity with ancient Rome. It's apparent in the transformation of the Chinese Empire, where nomadic conquerors repeatedly adopted Chinese culture while fundamentally altering it. The same dynamic can be seen in more recent examples. The British Empire didn't collapse overnight. It transformed gradually into the Commonwealth, preserving many forms and relationships while fundamentally changing their nature. The Soviet Union didn't disappear suddenly. It evolved into new states that maintained some institutions while abandoning the ideology that had originally justified them. In each case, the transformation was driven by practical pressures and immediate needs, rather than ideological opposition to the existing system. In each case, the people involved believed they were adapting and preserving rather than replacing and destroying. In each case, the cumulative effect was more revolutionary than anyone intended. This is why Rome's story remains so relevant. We live in another age of rapid change, another time when established institutions are under pressure to adapt to new circumstances. We face similar choices between preserving forms and preserving substance, between accommodation and resistance, between gradual change and dramatic transformation. The Roman example suggests that civilizations are more malleable than we might assume, but also more fragile. They can survive external shocks that seem devastating, but they can be transformed beyond recognition by internal changes that seem manageable. They can preserve their names and ceremonies while losing their essential character. The question for us is whether we can learn from Rome's experience. Can we distinguish between necessary adaptations and fundamental transformations? Can we preserve what matters most while changing what needs to change? Can we guide the process of change consciously rather than simply reacting to immediate pressures? These aren't easy questions, and Rome's example doesn't provide simple answers. But it does offer a warning about how civilizations can lose themselves in the process of trying to survive. It shows how reasonable people making rational decisions can collectively produce outcomes that none of them intended or desired. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. Rome transformed itself in response to barbarian pressure, and that transformation was so complete that it amounted to replacement. The lesson isn't that change should be resisted at all costs, but that change should be understood and directed rather than simply accepted as inevitable. Because in the end, Rome's fall wasn't really about barbarians or economics or military failure. It was about identity. It was about what it meant to be Roman and how that meaning changed until it meant something entirely different. It was about the slow erosion of shared values and common purpose until the empire became a collection of competing groups held together only by habit and inertia. And when that happened, when being Roman no longer meant anything distinctive or inspiring, the political structures built on Roman identity naturally collapsed, not because they were conquered, but because they were no longer necessary. The barbarians didn't need to destroy Rome. They just needed to wait for Rome to stop being Roman. That transformation, that slow dissolution of meaning and purpose, is the real threat that faces any civilization. External enemies can be defeated. Internal problems can be solved. But once a society loses confidence in its own values and purpose, once it stops believing that its way of life is worth preserving and defending, then all the military might and economic power in the world won't save it. This is the untold story of why Rome really fell. Not because it was weak, but because it forgot what made it strong. Not because it was conquered, but because it conquered itself. And the most frightening part of this story is how familiar it sounds when you look around at our own world today. The transformation wasn't just happening in the countryside or on distant frontiers. It was visible in the heart of Rome itself, if you knew how to look. Walk through the Forum in the year 450, and you'd see senators in togas debating with Germanic chieftains in Roman dress. You'd hear Latin mixed with Gothic, Vandal, and Frankish phrases. You'd watch Roman citizens conducting business according to customs their grandfathers wouldn't have recognized. The Colosseum still hosted games, but the gladiators were increasingly Germanic prisoners fighting for the entertainment of audiences that included as many barbarians as Romans. The baths still functioned, but the conversations echoing off their marble walls were as likely to be about tribal politics as imperial affairs. The temples were mostly empty, replaced by churches where Germanic converts worshipped alongside Romans who had forgotten their own ancestral gods. What's most striking about this period is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. They weren't witnessing the fall of civilization. They were watching civilization adapt, evolve, find new forms. The changes felt natural, inevitable, even beneficial. Order was maintained. Life went on. The empire endured, at least in name. But something fundamental was being lost in translation. The Roman concept of citizenship, which had once meant participation in a universal legal and political community, was becoming a hollow title. The Roman idea of public service, which had motivated generations of leaders to sacrifice personal gain for collective benefit, was giving way to more personal forms of loyalty and obligation. The Latin language itself tells this story in miniature. Classical Latin had been precise, systematic, designed for administration and law. It distinguished carefully between different types of authority, different grades of citizenship, different categories of legal relationship. The Latin of the 5th century was becoming something looser, more emotional, better suited to personal relationships than institutional governance. You can see this linguistic shift in the letters that survived from the period. Officials still wrote in formal Latin when conducting government business, but their personal correspondence reveals a language that was becoming more Germanic in its rhythms, more Christian in its vocabulary, more focused on immediate concerns than abstract principles. The legal system underwent a similar transformation. Roman law had been famous for its systematic nature, its logical consistency, its universal application. But as Germanic customs were incorporated into legal practice, this systematic quality began to break down. Different communities followed different rules. Different types of people were subject to different laws. Personal relationships became more important than abstract principles. This legal fragmentation reflected a deeper social change. Roman society had been hierarchical, but it had also been somewhat meritocratic. Talent and ambition could overcome humble origins. Military service or administrative skill could lead to advancement. Education could open doors, regardless of birth. The society that was emerging in the late Empire was more rigid, more dependent on personal connections and inherited status. Germanic nobles married into Roman aristocratic families, creating a new elite that combined the worst aspects of both systems. They had the exclusivity of Germanic tribalism and the arrogance of Roman aristocracy, but lacked the civic responsibility that had once characterized the best of Roman leadership. The economic transformation was equally profound. The Roman economy had been built on trade, urban markets, and monetary exchange. Goods flowed freely throughout the empire because Roman law protected merchants and Roman legions protected trade routes. Cities flourished because they served as nodes in this vast commercial network. As imperial authority fragmented, this economic system began to break down, not catastrophically, but gradually. Trade routes became less secure. Different regions developed their own currencies. Local strongmen imposed their own taxes and regulations. The integrated Mediterranean economy that had been Rome's greatest achievement slowly dissolved into smaller, more isolated markets. This economic localization had profound social consequences. The urban middle classes that had been the backbone of Roman civilization found their livelihood threatened. Many migrated to the countryside, where they could produce their own food and find protection from local lords. Others adapted their skills to serve new Germanic masters who valued different kinds of expertise. The result was a gradual ruralization of society. Cities didn't disappear overnight, but they lost their central role in economic and political life. The villa system that had once been a supplement to urban civilization became its replacement. Large estates became self-sufficient communities, producing their own food, making their own goods, maintaining their own security. This shift from urban to rural life represented more than just an economic change. It reflected a fundamental alteration in how people understood their place in the world. Roman civilization had been essentially urban, cosmopolitan, outward-looking. The society that was replacing it was more insular, more focused on immediate family and local community, less interested in distant places and abstract ideas. The educational system both reflected and accelerated these changes. The classical curriculum that had produced generations of capable administrators was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Why learn rhetoric when political decisions were made through personal negotiations rather than public debate? Why study philosophy when practical survival skills were more immediately useful? Christian schools were replacing secular ones, but they emphasized different values and taught different skills. Theological training took precedence over practical administration. Moral instruction became more important than legal reasoning. Preparation for the next world mattered more than competence in this one. This educational transformation had long-term consequences that weren't immediately apparent. Each generation of leaders was slightly less capable of managing complex institutions than the one before. Administrative skills that had once been common became rare specialties. The knowledge needed to maintain Roman-style governance gradually disappeared. The military changes we've discussed were part of this larger pattern. The disciplined professionalism of the classical legions required extensive training, systematic organization, and institutional memory. As Germanic warriors were integrated into Roman forces, these qualities were gradually lost. Germanic military culture emphasized personal courage, individual prowess, and loyalty to specific leaders. These weren't necessarily inferior values, but they were incompatible with the systematic approach that had made Roman armies so effective. A force of brave individuals following charismatic chiefs could win battles, but it couldn't sustain the kind of long-term strategic campaigns that had built the empire. The religious transformation was perhaps the most complex aspect of this period. Christianity didn't weaken Rome in any simple sense. Many of the empire's most capable leaders in the 4th and 5th centuries were devout Christians. The church provided institutional continuity when secular institutions were failing. Christian bishops often served as effective administrators when imperial officials were incompetent or absent. But Christianity also changed Roman culture in subtle ways that had long-term political consequences. The Christian emphasis on humility and other worldly concerns didn't mesh well with the Roman tradition of civic pride and worldly achievement. Christian universalism conflicted with Roman particularism. Christian pacifism, even when honored more in theory than practice, undermined the military ethos that had sustained Roman expansion. More importantly, Christianity provided an alternative focus for loyalty and identity. A devout Christian's primary allegiance was to God and the Church, not to the emperor and the state. This wasn't necessarily treasonous. Most Christians were loyal citizens, but it meant that political authority was no longer the highest value in society. The Germanic peoples who were settling in Roman territories often converted to Christianity, but they brought their own interpretations to the new faith. Germanic Christianity emphasized personal relationships with divine power, warrior virtues adapted to spiritual combat, and tribal loyalties extended to religious communities. This wasn't the same Christianity that Roman theologians were developing, but it was equally valid and often more emotionally satisfying. The result was a religious synthesis that was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic, but something genuinely new. This Christian culture provided a bridge between the Roman past and the post-Roman future, but it also facilitated the transformation of Roman civilization into something unrecognizable. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this entire process was how little anyone understood what was happening. The Romans, who accommodated Germanic settlers, thought they were being practical and flexible. The Germanic leaders who adopted Roman titles believed they were joining a superior civilization. The church officials who blessed these arrangements imagined they were expanding Christendom. Nobody was trying to end the Roman Empire. Everyone was trying to preserve what they valued while adapting to changing circumstances. The fact that their collective efforts produced the opposite of what they intended reveals something profound about how historical change actually works. Civilizations don't usually die from external attack or internal rebellion. They transform gradually as millions of individuals make reasonable decisions in response to immediate pressures. Each choice seems logical at the time, each compromise appears necessary, but the cumulative effect can be revolutionary. This is what makes Rome's story so unsettling for modern readers. We like to think that major historical changes result from dramatic events and conscious decisions. We prefer narratives where heroes and villains make clear choices that lead to obvious consequences. The reality is often more subtle and more disturbing. Rome fell because Romans made thousands of small, rational decisions that collectively undermined the civilization they were trying to preserve. They chose accommodation over resistance, adaptation over principle, survival over identity. Each choice was defensible. All of them together were fatal. The barbarians didn't conquer Rome. They didn't need to. Romans gave them what they wanted in exchange for what Romans needed. Land for military service, titles for loyalty, recognition for support. It seemed like a fair exchange at the time. Only in retrospect did it become clear that Rome was trading away its future for temporary security. This pattern of incremental compromise leading to fundamental transformation isn't unique to Rome. It appears throughout history whenever established civilizations encounter sustained pressure from emerging forces. The process is usually gradual, usually collaborative, and usually invisible to the people participating in it. The Chinese Empire repeatedly experienced similar transformations when nomadic peoples conquered the northern provinces. The invaders would adopt Chinese administrative techniques and cultural forms, while gradually imposing their own values and practices. The result was a synthesis that preserved Chinese civilization in name, while fundamentally altering its character. The Islamic conquests followed a different but parallel pattern. Muslim armies conquered vast territories with surprising speed, but they preserved many existing institutions while gradually transforming them according to Islamic principles. Local populations often welcomed these changes because Islamic rule was frequently more tolerant and efficient than what it replaced. The Mongol Empire created similar syntheses wherever it established control. Mongol rulers adopted the administrative practices of conquered peoples while maintaining their own military culture and political structure. The result was a series of hybrid civilizations that combined Mongol and local elements in new ways. In each case, the transformation was facilitated by the practical needs of both conquerors and conquered. Invaders needed local knowledge and administrative skills. Local populations needed security and economic opportunity. The arrangements that emerged from these needs seemed beneficial to everyone involved, at least in the short term. But these practical arrangements inevitably led to cultural changes that went far beyond what anyone originally intended. Languages mixed, religions syncretized, legal systems hybridized, social structures adapted. Within a few generations, the resulting civilization was something unprecedented, something that belonged fully neither to the conquerors nor the conquered. The Roman case is particularly instructive because it shows how this process can occur even when the barbarians desperately want to join the existing civilization rather than replace it. The Germanic peoples who settled in Roman territories weren't trying to destroy Roman culture. They were trying to become Roman, but their very presence changed what it meant to be Roman. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Rome's transformation. Civilizations can be destroyed not just by enemies who hate them, but by admirers who love them enough to want to join them. The process of inclusion, if it happens too rapidly or on too large a scale, can alter the character of the civilization being joined. The Romans understood this danger in the abstract. They had always been careful about extending citizenship, insisting that new citizens demonstrate their commitment to Roman values and practices. The citizenship process was designed to ensure that new Romans would strengthen rather than weaken Roman civilization. But the pressures of the 4th and 5th centuries forced Rome to abandon these careful procedures. The empire needed manpower more than it needed cultural purity. Germanic allies were granted citizenship and high office without the gradual assimilation process that had worked so well in earlier centuries. The result was predictable in hindsight. New citizens who hadn't been fully Romanized brought their own values and practices into Roman institutions. They modified these institutions to better serve their needs and reflect their understanding of how society should work. Within a few generations, Roman institutions had been transformed beyond recognition. This doesn't mean that immigration or cultural mixing is inherently dangerous. The Roman Empire had successfully integrated diverse peoples for centuries, but it does suggest that the pace and scale of integration matter enormously. When change happens gradually, societies can adapt while maintaining their essential character. When change happens too rapidly, the result can be transformation rather than integration. The economic parallels to our own time are particularly striking. The Roman Empire created the ancient world's first truly global economy, with standardized currencies, international trade networks, and integrated markets spanning 3 continents. This economic integration was one of Rome's greatest achievements, bringing prosperity and opportunity to millions of people. But this same economic integration also created vulnerabilities that became apparent during the crisis periods. When political authority fragmented, economic networks became unstable. When different regions pursued their own interests, the integrated system began to break apart. When local strongmen prioritized immediate gains over long-term stability, the whole structure became increasingly fragile. The modern global economy faces similar challenges. International trade networks, integrated financial systems, and global supply chains have created unprecedented prosperity and opportunity. But they've also created new vulnerabilities to political instability, cultural conflict, and economic disruption. Like their Roman predecessors, modern leaders face difficult choices between short-term adaptation and long-term preservation. How much change can existing institutions absorb without losing their essential character? How much accommodation can be made to new pressures without fundamentally altering the system being preserved? These aren't questions with easy answers, but Rome's example suggests that the answers matter more than we might think. Civilizations that successfully navigate these challenges can endure for centuries. Those that fail to find the right balance can transform beyond recognition within a few generations. The cultural dimensions of Rome's transformation also resonate with contemporary concerns. Roman civilization had been built on certain assumptions about citizenship, law, social organization, and human nature. These assumptions worked well for centuries, creating a stable and prosperous society that attracted admiration throughout the known world. But when large numbers of people with different assumptions were integrated into Roman society, these foundational beliefs came under pressure. Not through direct attack, the Germanic peoples generally admired Roman civilization, but through the gradual introduction of alternative ways of thinking about the same basic questions. The result was a slow erosion of cultural consensus. Romans could no longer take for granted that their fellow citizens shared the same basic values and assumptions. Political discussions became more difficult because participants were operating from different premises. Legal proceedings became more complex because different groups followed different customs. Social relationships became more complicated because people had different expectations about proper behavior. This cultural fragmentation made effective governance increasingly difficult. Policies that seemed obviously correct to one group appeared misguided or harmful to another. Compromises that satisfied some communities alienated others. Leaders found themselves constantly negotiating between different constituencies with incompatible demands. The parallels to contemporary multicultural societies are obvious and unsettling. Like their Roman predecessors, modern democratic societies are grappling with questions about how much cultural diversity they can accommodate without losing social cohesion. How much difference can be integrated without undermining the shared values that make democratic governance possible? Again, these aren't questions with simple answers. Cultural diversity can be a source of strength, bringing new perspectives and capabilities to society, but it can also create challenges for social unity and political cooperation. The key is finding ways to preserve enough common ground to maintain effective institutions while allowing enough diversity to benefit from different approaches and perspectives. Rome's experience suggests that this balance is achievable but fragile. It requires conscious effort to maintain shared values and common purpose. It demands institutions capable of integrating diverse groups without being transformed beyond recognition. Most importantly, it needs leaders who understand the difference between necessary adaptation and fundamental transformation. The religious dimensions of Rome's transformation offer yet another lens through which to view contemporary challenges. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire wasn't just a change in religious belief. It represented a fundamental shift in how people understood their relationship to authority, community, and ultimate purpose. Traditional Roman religion had been essentially civic, focused on maintaining the favor of the gods for the benefit of the state and society. Christian religion was essentially personal, focused on individual salvation and relationship with God. These different orientations led to different priorities and different approaches to social and political questions. The transition from civic to personal religion had profound consequences for Roman political culture. Citizens, who had once felt primary loyalty to the state, increasingly felt primary loyalty to the church. Leaders who had once derived authority from their service to Rome increasingly derived authority from their relationship to God. Institutions that had once been justified by their contribution to collective welfare increasingly had to justify themselves in terms of moral and spiritual values. This wasn't necessarily a negative development. Christian values of compassion, humility, and universal love represented genuine improvements over some aspects of traditional Roman culture. Christian institutions often provided better care for the poor, the sick, and the marginalized than their pagan predecessors had done. But the shift from civic to religious priorities also created new challenges for political governance. How do you run a practical political system based on otherworldly values? How do you make necessary compromises when your ultimate loyalty is to absolute moral principles? How do you maintain social unity when people's primary identity is religious rather than political? These challenges weren't insurmountable. Many Christian societies have developed effective forms of political governance, but they did require new approaches and new institutions. The Roman political system, designed for a civic culture, was poorly adapted to a religious one. The result was a gradual hollowing out of Roman political institutions. They continued to function, but with decreasing effectiveness and legitimacy. Real authority increasingly passed to religious leaders who better understood how to motivate and organize people with primarily religious identities. Contemporary societies face analogous challenges as traditional civic identities compete with various forms of identity politics. Whether based on religion, ethnicity, ideology, or other factors, These alternative identities can create similar tensions between particular loyalties and universal citizenship. The question isn't whether such alternative identities are legitimate. They often represent important aspects of human experience that deserve recognition and respect. The question is how political institutions can accommodate diverse identities without being fragmented by them. Rome's experience suggests that this accommodation is possible, but requires careful attention to maintaining some form of overarching civic identity that transcends particular group loyalties. When such an identity exists, diverse groups can coexist and contribute to a common political project. When it disappears, political institutions become arenas for group competition rather than vehicles for collective governance. The technological dimensions of Rome's transformation are perhaps the least obvious, but potentially the most important for understanding contemporary challenges. Roman civilization had been built on certain technological capabilities: roads, aqueducts, military equipment, administrative tools that required sophisticated engineering knowledge and systematic maintenance. As the empire's educational and administrative systems deteriorated, the knowledge needed to maintain these technological systems began to disappear. Roads fell into disrepair because local authorities lacked the engineering expertise to fix them properly. Aqueducts broke down because no one understood how the original designers had solved complex hydraulic problems. Military equipment became less sophisticated because the skills needed to produce advanced weapons were being lost. This technological regression wasn't dramatic or sudden. Many Roman engineering works continued to function for centuries after the empire's fall. But the capacity to create new works of similar sophistication was gradually lost, and even the ability to maintain existing infrastructure eventually disappeared in many regions. The result was a slow degradation of the technological foundation that had made Roman civilization possible. Without good roads, trade became more difficult and expensive. Without reliable water supplies, cities couldn't maintain their populations. Without sophisticated military equipment, armies became less effective. Without efficient administrative tools, governance became more primitive. Contemporary societies face similar vulnerabilities. Our technological civilization depends on extremely complex systems that require specialized knowledge to maintain and improve. If the educational and institutional systems that preserve this knowledge were to deteriorate, the technological foundation of modern life could become fragile. The parallel isn't exact. Our technological systems are more robust than Roman ones in some ways, and our knowledge preservation systems are more sophisticated. But the basic vulnerability is similar. Complex technologies require complex societies to sustain them. If the social institutions that support technological development begin to fail, the technologies themselves eventually follow. This technological dimension of civilizational change is often overlooked because it operates slowly and invisibly. People living through the process might not notice the gradual degradation of capabilities until it reaches a critical point. By then, the knowledge and skills needed to reverse the decline might already be lost. Rome's story suggests that maintaining technological civilization requires more than just preserving specific knowledge and skills. It requires maintaining the social conditions that make technological development possible. Education systems that produce capable engineers, economic systems that reward innovation, political systems that support long-term investment in infrastructure, cultural systems that value practical knowledge and systematic thinking. When these social conditions deteriorate, technological regression can follow, even if the immediate pressures seem to be political or military rather than technological. The barbarians who transformed Rome weren't necessarily less intelligent than the Romans they replaced, but they came from societies that hadn't developed the same technological capabilities, and they lacked the institutional framework needed to maintain Roman technological achievements. The lesson for contemporary societies is that technological superiority is not permanent. It depends on maintaining the social conditions that make technological development possible. Those conditions can be eroded by political instability, economic inequality, educational decline, or cultural change. Once they're lost, rebuilding them can take centuries. This brings us back to the central question raised by Rome's transformation. How do we distinguish between necessary adaptation and dangerous transformation? How do we preserve what matters most while changing what needs to change? How do we maintain the social conditions that make our civilization possible while responding to new challenges and pressures? Rome's experience suggests that these questions don't have simple answers. Every generation faces new pressures that require some form of adaptation. The challenge is making these adaptations consciously and deliberately, rather than simply reacting to immediate circumstances. The Romans who presided over their empire's transformation weren't stupid or malicious. They were intelligent people facing difficult circumstances and making what seemed like reasonable decisions. Their failure wasn't a failure of intelligence or character. It was a failure of perspective, an inability to see how their individual decisions were contributing to a larger pattern of change that none of them intended. This failure of perspective is perhaps the greatest danger facing any civilization. When people focus entirely on immediate problems and short-term solutions, they can lose sight of long-term consequences and systemic effects. When institutions adapt constantly to external pressures without maintaining some core identity and purpose, they can transform beyond recognition. The antidote to this danger isn't resistance to all change. That would be impossible and ultimately self-defeating. It's conscious attention to the relationship between short-term adaptations and long-term preservation. It's institutional wisdom that can distinguish between changes that strengthen the system and changes that undermine it. It's cultural confidence that knows what values are negotiable and what principles are essential. Rome possessed these qualities during its rise and golden age. The Romans were remarkably good at adapting to new circumstances while maintaining their essential character. They integrated diverse peoples while preserving Roman identity. They adopted useful innovations while maintaining institutional continuity. They responded to changing conditions while staying true to core values. But somewhere during the late Empire, these capabilities were lost. Romans became reactive rather than proactive, accommodating rather than integrating, adaptive rather than preserving. The result was transformation that none of them wanted, but all of them facilitated. The question for us is whether we can do better. Can we learn from Rome's experience? Can we maintain the wisdom needed to distinguish between necessary change and dangerous transformation? Can we preserve what matters most about our civilization while adapting to new challenges? These aren't just academic questions. They're practical challenges that every democratic society faces every day. Every policy decision, every cultural change, every institutional adaptation either strengthens or weakens the foundation of our civilization. The cumulative effect of these decisions will determine whether our society thrives, transforms, or simply fades away. Rome's story suggests that the outcome isn't predetermined. Civilizations can endure for centuries if they maintain the wisdom needed to adapt without losing themselves. But they can also transform beyond recognition within a few generations if they lose sight of what makes them distinctive and valuable. The choice is ours, but it's a choice we make not just through dramatic political decisions, but through countless small adaptations and accommodations that seem reasonable at the time, but may have consequences we never intended. Understanding how Rome made that choice and how it led to results none of them wanted might help us make better choices in our own time. Because in the end, the question isn't whether our civilization will change. Change is inevitable. The question is whether we'll guide that change consciously or let it happen to us unconsciously, the way it happened to Rome. That choice becomes clearer when you look at what happened next. Because Rome's transformation didn't end with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. In some ways, it was just beginning. The Germanic kingdoms that emerged from the Western Empire's collapse weren't anti-Roman. They were hyper-Roman, at least in their own minds. The Visigothic kings in Spain issued laws based on Roman legal principles. The Frankish rulers in Gaul maintained Roman administrative structures. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy under Theodoric actually governed more effectively than the last Roman emperors had managed. These barbarian kings didn't see themselves as destroyers of Roman civilization. They saw themselves as its preservers, its true inheritors. Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy from Ravenna, commissioned Roman-style buildings, employed Roman administrators, and maintained Roman legal traditions. His court was more cultured and sophisticated than most late imperial courts had been. But here's the unsettling part. They were preserving Roman forms while operating according to completely different principles. It was like watching someone perform a play in a language they didn't understand. All the gestures were correct. All the costumes were authentic. But the meaning had been lost in translation. The legal system provides the clearest example. Germanic rulers preserved Roman legal codes, employed Roman-trained lawyers, maintained Roman court procedures. But the underlying concept of law had fundamentally changed. Roman law had been based on abstract principles applied universally. Germanic law was based on personal relationships and community customs. So you'd have a Gothic king sitting in judgment, wearing Roman robes, citing Roman precedents, following Roman procedures. But the actual decisions would be made according to Gothic concepts of honor, loyalty, and personal obligation. The form was Roman. The substance was something else entirely. This pattern repeated itself across every aspect of society. Germanic nobles adopted Roman titles, lived in Roman-style villas, sponsored Roman-style entertainment. But their understanding of nobility, property, and social obligation came from their tribal backgrounds. They were playing Roman aristocrats while thinking like Germanic chieftains. The economic system underwent the same kind of transformation. Trade continued, markets functioned, coins were minted with Latin inscriptions, but the economic relationships were increasingly feudal rather than commercial. Personal service replaced monetary exchange. Local production substituted for long-distance trade. Self-sufficient estates took the place of integrated markets. Even the physical landscape tells this story. If you visit Italy today, you can still see the remains of Theodoric's palace in Ravenna. It's built in the Roman style, decorated with Roman motifs, designed according to Roman architectural principles. But it's also subtly different. The proportions are slightly off. The decorative schemes blend Germanic and Roman elements. The overall effect is Roman, but Roman as understood by someone from a very different cultural background. This architectural evidence reveals something profound about cultural transmission. When one civilization adopts the forms of another, the forms inevitably change to reflect the adopter's understanding and needs. The change might be subtle at first, barely noticeable to contemporary observers. But over time, these small alterations accumulate into something fundamentally different. Language evolution provides another window into this process. Latin didn't disappear in the former Western provinces. It continued to be spoken, written, and taught. But it was being spoken by people whose native languages had different grammatical structures, different sound systems, different ways of organizing thought. The result was a gradual transformation of Latin itself. Pronunciation changed as Germanic speakers applied their own phonetic patterns. Grammar simplified as complex Latin constructions proved difficult for non-native speakers. Vocabulary expanded to include Germanic concepts that had no exact Latin equivalents. Within a few centuries, the Latin spoken in different regions had diverged so much that speakers from different areas could barely understand each other. The unified language that had once connected the entire Roman world was fracturing into the distinct Romance languages we know today. This linguistic fragmentation both reflected and accelerated the political fragmentation of the former empire. When people can't easily communicate with each other, they inevitably develop separate identities and interests. The universal Roman identity that had once transcended regional differences gradually gave way to more localized identities based on immediate community and cultural similarity. The Church played a crucial role in this transformation, serving as both preserver and transformer of Roman culture. Christian bishops maintained Latin literacy when secular education was declining. They preserved Roman legal concepts by incorporating them into church law. They continued Roman administrative practices in their ecclesiastical organization, but the Church was also adapting Roman culture to serve Christian purposes. Classical rhetoric was repurposed for preaching. Roman legal procedures were modified to address spiritual rather than worldly concerns. Roman organizational methods were applied to managing souls rather than provinces. The result was a hybrid culture that preserved many Roman elements while fundamentally altering their meaning and purpose. A Christian bishop in 6th century Gaul might read Cicero and Virgil, cite Roman law, and follow Roman administrative procedures. But he was using these Roman tools to build something that Cicero and Virgil would never have recognized as Roman. This cultural synthesis wasn't unique to the Western provinces. Similar processes were occurring throughout the former Roman world, but with different results depending on local conditions and the specific groups involved. In North Africa, Vandal rulers created their own blend of Germanic, Roman, and local traditions. In Britain, Anglo-Saxon settlers developed a culture that incorporated Romano-British elements alongside their Germanic heritage. Each of these regional syntheses was genuinely creative, producing new forms of art, literature, law, and social organization that drew on multiple traditions while belonging fully to none of them. The early medieval world was remarkably diverse and innovative, generating solutions to human problems that neither the Romans nor the various barbarian peoples had developed independently. But this creativity came at a cost. The universal culture that had once connected Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates River was gone forever. In its place was a patchwork of local cultures, each interesting in its own right, but lacking the scope and systematic organization that had made Roman civilization so impressive. The economic consequences of this cultural fragmentation were particularly severe. Roman prosperity had depended on long-distance trade networks that required common currencies, standardized weights and measures, and mutual trust between strangers. These networks couldn't function effectively when every region had its own customs, its own rulers, its own interpretation of commercial law. Trade didn't disappear, but it became more localized and more expensive. The sophisticated commercial relationships that had connected Britain to Syria gradually simplified into more basic exchanges between neighboring regions. The urban middle classes that had sustained Roman commercial life either migrated to rural areas or adapted their skills to serve local aristocratic households. Cities that had once served as nodes in a vast imperial network found themselves reduced to serving much smaller regional markets. Population declined not just because of warfare or disease, but because the economic foundation that had supported urban life was eroding. The ancient world's most urbanized civilization was slowly becoming rural again. This urban decline had profound cultural consequences. Cities had been the centers of Roman intellectual life, the places where educated people gathered to debate ideas, study literature, and develop new forms of knowledge. As cities shrank and became less important, intellectual life became more isolated and parochial. The great libraries that had preserved classical learning were dispersed or abandoned. The schools that had trained generations of administrators closed for lack of students and funding. The informal networks of scholars and teachers that had transmitted knowledge across the empire fragmented into smaller, more isolated groups. Knowledge didn't disappear entirely, but it became more fragmented and harder to access. A scholar in 6th century Italy might have access to some classical texts but not others. A student in Gaul might learn rhetoric but not mathematics. A bishop in Spain might understand theology but not natural philosophy. This intellectual fragmentation was both cause and consequence of the broader cultural transformation. As shared knowledge declined, it became harder for different regions to maintain common institutions and practices. As common institutions declined, it became harder to preserve and transmit shared knowledge. The military transformation followed a similar pattern. The disciplined professionalism of the classical legions had required extensive training, sophisticated organization, and institutional memory that transcended individual lifespans. These qualities couldn't be maintained when military service became increasingly personal and localized. Germanic warriors brought their own military traditions, which emphasized individual prowess, personal loyalty, and flexible tactics. These weren't necessarily inferior to Roman methods. Germanic armies often proved quite effective in battle, but they were incompatible with the systematic approach that had made Roman military dominance possible. The result was a gradual militarization of society, combined with a decline in military effectiveness. Warriors became more important socially, as they provided the only reliable source of security in an increasingly fragmented world. But armies became less capable of sustained campaigns and strategic coordination. This military transformation both reflected and accelerated the political fragmentation of the post-Roman world. Strong local leaders could provide security for their immediate followers, but they couldn't coordinate effectively with distant allies or maintain long-term strategic objectives. The result was a political landscape of small, competing territories rather than large, integrated states. The religious transformation was perhaps the most complex aspect of this entire process. Christianity provided a bridge between the Roman past and the post-Roman future. But it was a bridge that changed both sides of the divide. Roman Christianity absorbed Germanic religious concepts, while Germanic Christianity adopted Roman organizational methods. The result was a religious culture that preserved some elements of both traditions, while transforming them into something unprecedented. Christian monasticism combined Roman organizational skills with Germanic ascetic traditions. Christian kingship blended Roman concepts of imperial authority with Germanic ideas about warrior leadership. Christian theology integrated Roman philosophical methods with Germanic mythological themes. This religious synthesis was remarkably successful in many ways. It provided a framework for cooperation between different ethnic groups. It preserved important elements of classical learning. It created new forms of art and literature that would influence European culture for centuries. But it also represented a fundamental break with the classical past. The Christianity that emerged from this synthesis was quite different from the religion that had first challenged Roman paganism. It was more hierarchical, more militaristic, more focused on worldly power, and less concerned with the otherworldly spirituality that had originally distinguished it from pagan religions. The transformation wasn't complete by the 6th century, but the basic pattern was established. Roman civilization hadn't been destroyed, but it had been so thoroughly transformed that it was becoming something else entirely. The process would continue for centuries, gradually creating the medieval world that would eventually give birth to modern Europe. Understanding this transformation helps explain why the fall of Rome has remained such a contentious topic among historians. The empire didn't fall in any simple sense. It evolved, adapted, and transformed itself in response to changing circumstances. But the end result was so different from what had existed before that it's reasonable to speak of an ending, even though many elements continued. The lesson for contemporary societies is both reassuring and disturbing. Reassuring because it shows that civilizations are more resilient than they often appear. They can survive massive shocks, adapt to changed circumstances, and continue to influence the world long after their political structures have disappeared. But it's also disturbing because it shows how civilizations can lose themselves in the process of trying to survive. The Romans, who accommodated Germanic settlers, adopted Christian values, and modified their institutions, thought they were preserving Roman civilization. In many ways they were, but they were also transforming it beyond recognition. The question for us is whether we can learn to distinguish between preservation and transformation, between necessary adaptation and fundamental change. Can we maintain what's essential about our civilization while adapting to new challenges? Can we integrate new populations and new ideas without losing our core identity? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical challenges that every society faces in every generation. The choices we make about immigration, education, cultural values, and institutional reform will determine whether our civilization thrives, adapts, or transforms beyond recognition. Rome's story suggests that the outcome isn't predetermined. Civilizations can successfully navigate major challenges while maintaining their essential character, but they can also lose themselves gradually through thousands of small compromises and accommodations that seem reasonable individually but prove revolutionary collectively. The key is maintaining the wisdom to distinguish between the two, and that wisdom requires understanding not just what we want to preserve, but why those things are worth preserving, and how they connect to the deeper values and purposes that give our civilization meaning. Because in the end, Rome's transformation wasn't really about barbarians or economics or military tactics. It was about meaning. It was about what it meant to be Roman, and how that meaning changed until it meant something entirely different. When that happened, when Roman identity lost its distinctive content and compelling purpose, the political and social structures built on that identity naturally followed. The barbarians didn't need to destroy Rome. They just needed to wait for Rome to stop being Roman. And once that process was complete, once Roman civilization had transformed itself into something else, the old imperial structures became irrelevant. They weren't conquered. They were simply replaced by something that better served the needs and reflected the values of the new post-Roman world. This is the untold story of why Rome really fell. Not because it was weak, but because it was too flexible. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was transformed. Not because it failed to adapt, but because it adapted so completely that it ceased to be what it had always been. And the most unsettling part of this story is how familiar it sounds when you look around at our own world today. We too live in an age of rapid change, massive migration, cultural transformation, and institutional adaptation. We too face pressures to accommodate new populations, new ideas, new challenges that require us to modify our traditional ways of doing things. The question that should haunt us is whether we're preserving our civilization by adapting it, or transforming it beyond recognition in the name of preservation. Are we making the same kinds of reasonable, well-intentioned decisions that gradually transformed Rome into something unrecognizable? Are we so focused on solving immediate problems that we're losing sight of what makes our way of life distinctive and valuable? These questions don't have easy answers, but Rome's experience suggests that they're the most important questions any civilization can ask, because the alternative to asking them consciously is to answer them unconsciously, through the accumulated weight of countless small decisions that seem reasonable at the time, but lead to consequences no one intended. Rome fell because Romans stopped asking these questions. They became so focused on immediate survival that they lost sight of what they were trying to survive for. They preserved the forms while abandoning the substance, maintained the names while changing the meanings, kept the ceremonies while forgetting their purpose. The result was a civilization that called itself Roman, but had become something else entirely. And once that transformation was complete, the old Roman world simply faded away, not with a bang, but with a whisper, not through conquest, but through evolution. Not because it was destroyed, but because it had already ceased to exist. That's the real story of Rome's fall. And it's a story that's still being written in our choices and our compromises, our adaptations and our accommodations, every single day. The most chilling aspect of this transformation becomes clear when you examine what happened to the very concept of Roman citizenship itself. By the early 5th century, being a Roman citizen meant almost nothing. The legal protections were gone. The economic opportunities had vanished. The cultural prestige had evaporated. Yet people still carried the title, still claimed the identity, still insisted they were preserving something that had already ceased to exist. Consider Marcus, a fictional but typical Roman living in Gaul around 420. His grandfather had been a centurion who fought Germanic tribes along the Rhine. His father had served as a local magistrate, collecting taxes for distant emperors and enforcing laws written in Rome. But Marcus pays his taxes to a Frankish warlord who calls himself a Roman patrician but settles disputes according to Germanic custom. Marcus speaks Latin at home but learns Frankish to conduct business. His children will grow up bilingual, bicultural, belonging fully to neither world. Marcus still considers himself Roman. He wears a toga on ceremonial occasions. He celebrates traditional Roman holidays. He sends his sons to learn Latin rhetoric from a local priest. But when his neighbor steals his horse, he doesn't appeal to Roman law. He asks the Frankish chief to arbitrate. When bandits threaten his farm, he doesn't call for Roman legions. He seeks protection from the same Germanic warriors his grandfather fought against. This is how civilizations really die. Not through dramatic conquest, but through gradual irrelevance. Marcus hasn't stopped being Roman by choice. He's stopped being Roman because being Roman no longer provides what he needs to survive and prosper in the world he actually inhabits. The economic foundations tell the same story. Roman prosperity had depended on vast networks of trade that connected Britain to India, Spain to China. These networks required standardized currencies, reliable transportation, and most importantly, trust between strangers separated by thousands of miles. A merchant in Alexandria could do business with a trader in Lyon because both operated under the same legal system, used the same money, and shared enough cultural assumptions to make complex agreements possible. By the 5th century, this trust was evaporating. Not because people had become less trustworthy, but because they no longer shared the common framework that made trust possible. The merchant in Alexandria now dealt with Byzantine officials who spoke Greek and followed Eastern Roman law. The trader in Lyon answered to a Burgundian king who ruled according to Germanic custom. They might still call themselves Romans, but they lived in different worlds with different rules. Local strongmen stepped into this vacuum, providing the security and predictability that imperial institutions could no longer guarantee. A Frankish chief might not understand Roman commercial law, but he could protect trade routes within his territory. A Gothic king might not appreciate the subtleties of imperial taxation, but he could ensure that merchants received fair treatment in his courts. These local arrangements worked well enough for immediate needs. Trade continued, markets functioned, people made livings. But the vast, integrated economy that had sustained Roman civilization was fragmenting into smaller, simpler systems. The complexity that had made Roman prosperity possible was disappearing, replaced by arrangements that were more personal, more direct, and ultimately more limited. The military transformation reveals the same pattern. Roman armies had been professional forces serving abstract concepts like duty, honor, and imperial glory. They fought for causes larger than themselves, following strategies that might take years to unfold, accepting sacrifices for benefits they might never personally enjoy. Germanic warbands operated on completely different principles. They fought for their immediate leaders, for tangible rewards, for personal relationships. They were often more motivated and more fierce than Roman soldiers, but they couldn't sustain the kind of systematic campaigns that had built the empire. When their chief was satisfied, they went home. When the immediate threat was gone, they disbanded. When better opportunities arose elsewhere, they switched sides. These weren't necessarily worse military values, but they were incompatible with imperial strategy. You can't conquer and hold vast territories with warbands that fight for personal loyalty rather than strategic objectives. You can't maintain long-term defenses with forces that prioritize immediate gain over distant goals. The Romans tried to accommodate these differences, creating hybrid military systems that combined Roman organization with Germanic motivation. But the result was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic. It was something new, something that could provide local security but couldn't project power across continents or maintain the kind of systematic control that had made the empire possible. The cultural transformation was perhaps the most subtle, but ultimately the most decisive. Roman culture had been built on certain assumptions about human nature, social organization, and historical purpose. Romans believed that civilization was better than barbarism, that law was superior to custom, that universal principles were more valuable than particular loyalties. These beliefs weren't just intellectual positions. They were emotional commitments that motivated sacrifice, inspired loyalty, and provided meaning for millions of people. When a Roman soldier died defending a distant frontier, he wasn't just protecting his immediate community, he was defending an idea, a vision of human possibility that transcended tribal boundaries and ethnic divisions. By the 5th century, these beliefs were becoming harder to sustain. The barbarians weren't obviously inferior to the Romans. Germanic law often seemed more fair and responsive than Roman bureaucracy. Tribal loyalty frequently proved more reliable than imperial promises. The universal principles that Romans claimed to represent appeared increasingly hollow when confronted with the practical effectiveness of particular arrangements. The result was a gradual loss of cultural confidence. Romans began to doubt their own superiority, to question their own assumptions, to wonder whether their way of life was really worth preserving. This doubt didn't lead to dramatic rejection of Roman values, but to gradual accommodation of alternatives. If Germanic customs worked better in practice, why not adopt them? If tribal loyalty provided more security than imperial citizenship, why not embrace it? Each accommodation seemed reasonable. Each compromise solved an immediate problem. But the cumulative effect was revolutionary. Within a few generations, Roman culture had absorbed so many foreign elements that it was no longer recognizably Roman. The forms remained, but the spirit that had animated them was gone. This cultural transformation was accelerated by the rise of Christianity, though not in the way that many historians suggest. Christianity didn't weaken Roman military virtue or undermine imperial authority directly. Instead, it provided an alternative framework for understanding human purpose and social organization that gradually displaced older Roman concepts. Traditional Roman culture had been essentially civic, focused on participation in political community and service to the state. Christian culture was essentially spiritual, focused on individual salvation and relationship with God. These different orientations led to different priorities, different loyalties, different ways of thinking about social obligation. A devout Christian might still serve in the imperial administration or fight in Roman armies, but his ultimate allegiance was to the church rather than the state. His primary identity was religious rather than political. His deepest commitments were spiritual rather than civic. This didn't necessarily make him a bad Roman, but it meant that being Roman was no longer the most important thing about him. The Germanic peoples who were settling within the empire often converted to Christianity, but they brought their own interpretations to the new faith. Germanic Christianity emphasized personal relationships with divine power, warrior virtues adapted to spiritual combat, and tribal loyalties extended to religious communities. This wasn't the same Christianity that Roman theologians were developing, but it was equally valid and often more emotionally satisfying. The result was a religious synthesis that bridged Roman and Germanic cultures while transforming both. Christian Romans and Christian Germans could worship together, intermarry, and cooperate in ways that had been impossible when they followed different religions. But the Christianity that emerged from this synthesis was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic. It was something new that that provided unity at the cost of distinctiveness. Language tells this story most clearly. Latin survived the fall of the Western Empire, but it survived by changing. The elegant, precise Latin of Cicero and Virgil gradually gave way to something rougher, more colloquial, more influenced by the speech patterns of non-Roman populations. Scholars continued to write in classical style, but the Latin spoken in markets and homes was evolving into what would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and the other Romance languages. This linguistic evolution wasn't just about vocabulary and grammar. It reflected deeper changes in how people thought about the world. Classical Latin had been designed for administration, for law, for the precise communication needed to govern a vast empire. The emerging vernaculars were better suited to local concerns, personal relationships, immediate practical needs. As the language changed, so did the concepts it could express. Ideas that had been central to Roman culture became harder to articulate. Legal principles that had seemed obvious in classical Latin became ambiguous in the simplified versions spoken by Germanic settlers. Political concepts that had motivated Roman citizens for centuries gradually lost their meaning, as the words used to express them acquired new connotations. The educational system that might have preserved these concepts was also breaking down. The classical curriculum that had produced generations of capable administrators was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the realities of post-Roman life. Why learn rhetoric when political decisions were made through personal negotiation rather than public debate? Why study philosophy when practical survival skills were more immediately useful? Christian schools were replacing secular ones, but they emphasized different values and taught different skills. Theological training took precedence over practical administration. Moral instruction became more important than legal reasoning. Preparation for the afterlife mattered more than competence in worldly affairs. This educational transformation had long-term consequences that weren't immediately apparent. Each generation of leaders was slightly less capable of managing complex institutions than the one before. Administrative skills that had once been common became rare specialties. The knowledge needed to maintain Roman-style governance gradually disappeared. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle of decline. As administrative competence decreased, institutions became less effective. As institutions became less effective, people lost confidence in them. As confidence declined, alternative arrangements became more attractive. As alternatives gained acceptance, traditional institutions became even less relevant. This cycle wasn't inevitable, but it was extremely difficult to reverse once it reached a certain point. By the mid-5th century, Roman institutions in the West were so weakened and discredited that even people who wanted to preserve them often found it easier to work with Germanic alternatives. The physical landscape itself bears witness to this transformation. If you visit the ruins of Roman cities today, you can see how they changed during the late imperial period. The grand public buildings that had been the pride of classical civilization were gradually abandoned or converted to other uses. Forums became markets serving local rather than imperial needs. Basilicas were subdivided into smaller spaces or turned into churches. Amphitheatres were quarried for building stone or turned into fortified residences. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't the result of deliberate destruction. They reflected changing priorities and changing capabilities. People still needed meeting spaces, but they didn't need the vast forums designed for imperial ceremonies. They still wanted entertainment, but they couldn't afford the elaborate spectacles that had filled classical amphitheatres. They still required justice, but they preferred courts that operated according to familiar customs rather than abstract legal principles. The archaeological evidence shows adaptation rather than abandonment, modification rather than destruction. Roman cities didn't die suddenly. They evolved gradually into something that served the needs of their inhabitants, while losing the characteristics that had made them distinctively Roman.
Path,
This physical transformation both reflected and accelerated the cultural changes we've been discussing. When the spaces where Roman civic life had taken place disappeared or changed function, Roman civic culture itself became harder to maintain. When the buildings that had embodied Roman values were converted to other purposes, those values became less visible and less compelling. The road system tells a similar story. Roman roads didn't disappear after the empire's fall, but they were increasingly used for local rather than long-distance travel. The intensive maintenance required to keep them in perfect condition was beyond the capabilities of Germanic kingdoms. Gradually, they deteriorated from highways capable of moving legions rapidly across continents to local routes connecting neighboring settlements. This transportation decline had profound economic and political consequences. Trade became more localized and more expensive. Political control became harder to exercise over distant territories. Cultural exchange became less frequent and less systematic. The networks that had held the Roman world together gradually weakened until they could no longer support imperial-scale organization. Yet even as these networks declined, their memory persisted. Medieval kings continued to claim the title of Roman emperor. Medieval lawyers continued to cite Roman legal precedents. Medieval scholars continued to study Roman literature and philosophy. The idea of Rome remained powerful long after Roman reality had disappeared. This persistence of Roman symbolism alongside the abandonment of Roman substance reveals something profound about how civilizations end. They don't usually disappear completely. Instead, they transform into something that preserves their memory while abandoning their essential characteristics. The forms survive while the content changes. The names continue while the meanings evolve. This pattern appears throughout history. The Chinese Empire repeatedly experienced similar transformations when nomadic peoples conquered northern provinces. The conquerors would adopt Chinese titles, Chinese administrative techniques, Chinese cultural forms. But they would interpret these Chinese elements according to their own values and priorities, creating syntheses that were neither fully Chinese nor fully nomadic. The Islamic conquests followed a parallel pattern. Muslim armies conquered vast territories with remarkable speed, but they often preserved existing institutions while gradually transforming them according to Islamic principles. Local populations frequently welcomed these changes because Islamic rule was often more tolerant and efficient than what it replaced. In each case, the transformation was gradual and collaborative rather than sudden and violent. Conquerors and conquered found ways to work together that seemed beneficial to both sides. But the long-term result was the creation of new civilizations that combined elements from different traditions while belonging fully to none of them. The Roman case is particularly instructive because it shows how this process can occur even when the barbarians desperately want to join the existing civilization rather than replace it. The Germanic peoples who settled in Roman territories weren't trying to destroy Roman culture. They were trying to become Roman, but their very presence changed what it meant to be Roman. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Rome's transformation. Civilizations can be changed not just by enemies who hate them, but by admirers who love them enough to want to join them. The process of inclusion, if it happens too rapidly or on too large a scale, can alter the character of the civilization being joined. The modern implications of this lesson are both obvious and disturbing. We live in another age of massive population movements, cultural mixing, and institutional adaptation. Democratic societies around the world are grappling with questions about how much diversity they can accommodate while maintaining social cohesion and political effectiveness. The Roman example doesn't provide simple answers to these contemporary challenges, but it does suggest that the pace and scale of change matter enormously. Societies that successfully integrate diverse populations over long periods can maintain their essential character while benefiting from new perspectives and capabilities. Societies that experience rapid demographic and cultural change may find their institutions and values transformed beyond recognition. The key variable seems to be whether the receiving society maintains enough confidence in its own values and institutions to shape the integration process consciously. Rome succeeded in integrating diverse peoples for centuries because Romans believed strongly in the superiority of Roman civilization and insisted that newcomers adapt to Roman norms. When that confidence faltered during the crisis periods of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the integration process reversed. Instead of Romans civilizing barbarians, barbarians began barbarizing Romans. The result was a synthesis that preserved Roman forms while abandoning Roman substance. The question for contemporary societies is whether they can maintain the cultural confidence needed to guide integration processes consciously, rather than simply adapting to external pressures reactively. This requires clear understanding of what values and institutions are essential to preserve, and what aspects of the existing system can be modified without losing its essential character. It also requires wisdom about the relationship between short-term accommodation and long-term preservation. Every society faces immediate pressures that require some form of adaptation. The challenge is making these adaptations in ways that strengthen rather than weaken the system's long-term viability. Rome's experience suggests that this balance is achievable but fragile. It requires institutions capable of maintaining standards while remaining flexible. It demands leaders who understand the difference between necessary change and fundamental transformation. Most importantly, it needs citizens who believe strongly enough in their civilization's values to insist that those values be preserved even as other aspects of society evolve. When these conditions exist, societies can successfully navigate major challenges while maintaining their essential identity. When they don't exist, the result can be transformation so complete that the original civilization effectively disappears, even though many of its forms survive. This is what happened to Rome. The empire didn't fall to external conquest. It transformed itself in response to external pressures until it became something that retained Roman names while operating according to completely different principles. The process was gradual, collaborative, and largely unconscious, but the result was revolutionary. The lesson for us is clear. Civilizations are more fragile than they appear, but they're also more resilient than we might expect. They can survive enormous shocks and adapt to changed circumstances, but they can also lose themselves in the process of adaptation if they're not careful about preserving what makes them distinctive and valuable. The choice between preservation and transformation isn't made through dramatic political decisions. It's made through countless small choices about how to respond to immediate pressures and solve practical problems. Each choice seems reasonable at the time, but their cumulative effect determines whether a civilization thrives, adapts, or simply fades away into something unrecognizable. Rome made those choices unconsciously, reacting to circumstances rather than guiding them. The result was a transformation that none of them wanted, but all of them facilitated. Whether we can do better depends on whether we can learn from their experience and make our own choices more consciously and deliberately, because the alternative to conscious choice is unconscious transformation. And once that process reaches a certain point, it becomes irreversible. The civilization you're trying to save becomes the civilization you've already lost, preserved in name, but abandoned in substance, maintained in form, but emptied of meaning. That's the real story of why Rome fell. And it's a story that every civilization tells in its own way, in its own time, through its own choices about what to preserve and what to change, what to resist and what to accommodate, what matters enough to fight for, and what can be safely abandoned. The question for us is whether we're writing the same story, making the same choices, heading toward the same destination. Because if we are, then understanding what happened to Rome becomes more than just historical curiosity. It becomes a mirror, showing us not just where Rome went wrong, but where we might be going wrong as well. And that recognition, unsettling as it may be, might be the first step toward writing a different ending to our own civilizational story. But only if we're willing to look honestly at what we see reflected in Rome's mirror and act on what we learn before it's too late to change course. The mirror. Rome holds up to our modern world becomes more unsettling the longer you stare into it, because the patterns that destroyed the greatest empire in human history aren't ancient curiosities. They're playing out right now, in our institutions, our communities, our daily choices about what we're willing to preserve and what we're prepared to sacrifice for the sake of immediate convenience. Consider how Rome's transformation began with the best of intentions. Every compromise seemed reasonable. Every accommodation appeared necessary. Every adaptation looked like wisdom in the face of changing circumstances. The Romans who presided over their empire's gradual dissolution weren't villains or fools. They were practical people making sensible decisions under pressure. Sound familiar? Today we face our own version of Rome's challenge. Mass migration that strains traditional institutions. Economic pressures that force difficult choices between immediate needs and long-term stability. Cultural changes that challenge established values while promising new opportunities. Political fragmentation that makes coordinated action increasingly difficult. Like the late Romans, we tell ourselves we're adapting while preserving what matters most. We modify our institutions to accommodate new pressures while insisting we're maintaining their essential character. We adjust our values to reflect changing circumstances while claiming we're staying true to fundamental principles. But are we? Or are we making the same kinds of reasonable, well-intentioned decisions that gradually transformed Rome into something unrecognizable? Are we so focused on solving immediate problems that we're losing sight of what makes our civilization distinctive and worth preserving? The most chilling parallel lies in how Rome lost its sense of shared purpose. By the 5th century, Romans could no longer agree on what it meant to be Roman. Different groups had different interpretations of Roman identity, Roman values, Roman destiny. This fragmentation made collective action impossible and common sacrifice meaningless. We see similar fractures emerging in our own societies. The shared narratives that once bound diverse populations together are breaking down. The common values that made democratic governance possible are being questioned. The institutions that once commanded broad respect are losing legitimacy among significant portions of the population. Like the Romans, we're trying to hold things together through accommodation and compromise. We tell ourselves that diversity is strength, that change is inevitable, that adaptation is wisdom. And in many ways, these things are true. But Rome's experience reminds us that there are limits to how much change any system can absorb while maintaining its essential character. The question isn't whether change is necessary. Change is always necessary. The question is whether we're guiding that change consciously or simply reacting to it unconsciously. Are we making deliberate choices about what to preserve and what to modify? Or are we letting circumstances make those choices for us? Rome's transformation accelerated when Romans stopped believing in the superiority of their own civilization. They began to doubt whether Roman ways were really better than barbarian alternatives. This doubt led to accommodation. Accommodation led to synthesis, and synthesis led to replacement. We face similar challenges to our cultural confidence. Many people today question whether Western democratic values are universally applicable, or merely one option among many equally valid alternatives. This questioning can lead to healthy self-reflection and necessary reforms, but it can also lead to the kind of doubt that undermines the very foundations of civilizational coherence. The economic parallels are equally troubling. Rome's prosperity had depended on vast networks of trade and exchange that required common standards, shared trust, and coordinated governance. As political authority fragmented and cultural consensus broke down, these networks became unsustainable. Today's global economy faces similar vulnerabilities. International trade, financial systems, and supply chains depend on institutions and agreements that require ongoing cooperation between diverse nations and cultures. If the political and cultural foundations supporting these arrangements weaken, the economic superstructure built on them becomes increasingly fragile. The technological dimension adds new complexity to these ancient patterns. Our civilization depends even more heavily than Rome's did on maintaining sophisticated systems that require specialized knowledge and coordinated effort. If the educational and institutional systems that preserve this knowledge deteriorate, our technological capabilities could prove as fragile as Rome's political ones. But perhaps the most important lesson from Rome's transformation concerns the role of elites in civilizational change. Roman aristocrats who allied with Germanic chieftains thought they were preserving their positions within the existing system. They didn't realize they were helping to create a new system that would ultimately make their old positions irrelevant. Contemporary elites face similar temptations. Accommodation with new forces often seems like the path of least resistance. Adaptation to changing circumstances appears more realistic than resistance. But Rome's example suggests that such strategies can succeed in the short term while failing catastrophically in the long run. The religious and cultural transformations that reshaped Rome also echo in our contemporary struggles. Christianity provided a bridge between Roman and Germanic cultures, but it transformed both in the process. Today, various ideologies serve similar bridging functions, allowing different groups to cooperate while gradually changing the nature of the cooperation itself. These ideological syntheses often appear beneficial because they reduce conflict and enable coordination between previously antagonistic groups. But they can also dilute the distinctive values and practices that made the original civilization worth preserving in the first place. Education plays a crucial role in these processes. Rome's transformation accelerated when classical education gave way to alternatives that emphasized different skills and different values. Each generation became slightly less capable of maintaining the institutions that previous generations had built. We see similar educational shifts today. Traditional curricula are being modified to reflect new priorities and serve new populations. These changes often serve legitimate purposes and address real needs. But they also raise questions about whether we're preserving the knowledge and skills needed to maintain our civilization's distinctive achievements. The linguistic dimension provides another window into these processes. Language shapes thought, and changes in how we speak reflect changes in how we think about fundamental questions. The evolution of Latin into the Romance languages paralleled the transformation of Roman culture into something different. Today, we're witnessing similar linguistic evolution as new vocabularies emerge to describe changing social realities. These linguistic changes aren't necessarily problematic, but they do indicate deeper shifts in how people understand identity, community, and social obligation. Urban life, which was central to Roman civilization, also underwent fundamental transformation as the empire evolved. Cities remained important, but their role and character changed as they adapted to new populations and new purposes. Contemporary cities face similar pressures. Immigration, economic change, and cultural evolution are reshaping urban life in ways that preserve some traditional functions while abandoning others. The long-term consequences of these changes may not become apparent until they're irreversible. Perhaps most importantly, Rome's story reveals how civilizations can lose themselves gradually through processes that seem beneficial to the people experiencing them. The Germanic settlers who transformed Roman provinces weren't destroyers. They were often more committed to preserving Roman institutions than the Romans themselves. This suggests that civilizational threats don't always come from obvious enemies. They can come from friends, allies, and admirers who want to join and improve the existing system. The process of inclusion, if not carefully managed, can transform the system being joined beyond recognition. The question for us is whether we understand these dynamics well enough to navigate them successfully. Can we distinguish between changes that strengthen our civilization and changes that weaken it? Can we maintain the confidence needed to shape integration processes rather than simply adapting to them? Rome's experience suggests that these capabilities require more than good intentions or practical wisdom. They require deep understanding of what makes a civilization distinctive and valuable. They require institutions capable of preserving essential characteristics while adapting to changing circumstances. Most importantly, they require citizens who believe strongly enough in their civilization's worth to insist that its core values be maintained even as other aspects evolve. When these conditions exist, societies can successfully navigate major challenges while maintaining their essential identity. When they don't exist, the result can be transformation so complete that the original civilization effectively disappears, even though many of its forms survive. This is what happened to Rome. It didn't fall to conquest. It transformed itself in response to pressures until it became something that retained Roman names while operating according to completely different principles. The people who presided over this transformation thought they were saving Rome. They were actually replacing it. The most unsettling aspect of this story is how normal the transformation felt to people living through it. Each generation made small adjustments to accommodate new circumstances. Each change seemed reasonable and temporary. The cumulative effect only became apparent in retrospect. We may be living through a similar process today. The changes we're making to accommodate new pressures and solve immediate problems may seem reasonable and necessary, but their cumulative effect could be revolutionary in ways we don't yet understand. The lesson isn't that all change should be resisted. That would be impossible and ultimately self-defeating. The lesson is that change should be understood and directed rather than simply accepted as inevitable. We need to distinguish between adaptations that preserve essential characteristics and transformations that abandon them. This requires honest assessment of what aspects of our civilization are truly essential and what aspects can be modified without losing our distinctive identity. It requires institutions capable of maintaining standards while remaining flexible. It demands leaders who understand the difference between necessary change and fundamental transformation. Most importantly, it requires citizens who care enough about their civilization's future to think seriously about its preservation. Not preservation as a museum piece, but preservation as a living tradition, capable of growth and adaptation while maintaining its essential character. Rome failed this test. The Romans of the 5th century preserved the forms of their civilization while abandoning its substance. They maintained the ceremonies while forgetting their meaning. They kept the titles while changing their significance. Whether we do better depends on whether we can learn from their experience. Can we make conscious choices about our civilization's future, rather than simply reacting to immediate pressures? Can we guide transformation rather than being transformed by it? These aren't just academic questions. They're practical challenges that every democratic society faces every day. Every policy decision, every cultural change, every institutional adaptation either strengthens or weakens the foundation of our way of life. The cumulative effect of these decisions will determine whether our civilization thrives, adapts successfully, or simply fades away into something unrecognizable. The choice is ours, but it's a choice we make not just through dramatic political decisions, but through countless small choices about what to preserve and what to change, what to resist, and what to accommodate. What matters enough to fight for and what can be safely abandoned? Rome's story suggests that these small choices matter more than the big ones. Grand pronouncements and dramatic gestures are less important than the daily decisions that gradually shape how institutions function and what values they embody. This makes the preservation of civilization everyone's responsibility, not just that of political leaders or cultural elites. Every citizen who cares about the future has a role to play in determining what that future looks like. The question is whether we'll play that role consciously and deliberately, or whether we'll simply drift along with circumstances until we wake up one day to discover that our civilization has become something we no longer recognize or value. Because in the end, that's how civilizations really die. Not through conquest or catastrophe, but through transformation so gradual that nobody notices until it's complete. Not through the actions of enemies, but through the decisions of friends who think they're preserving something while actually replacing it. Rome fell because Romans forgot what made Rome worth preserving. They kept the name while abandoning the substance, maintained the forms while changing the content, preserved the ceremonies while losing their meaning. The question that should haunt us is whether we're making the same mistake. Are we so focused on adapting to immediate pressures that we're losing sight of what makes our way of life distinctive and valuable? Are we preserving our civilization by changing it, or changing it so much that we're no longer preserving it at all? The answer to that question will determine whether future historians study our era as another example of successful adaptation, or as another cautionary tale about how great civilizations lose themselves in the process of trying to survive. And that answer depends not on what happens to us, but on what we choose to do. Because civilizations, like the people who comprise them, ultimately determine their own fate through the choices they make and the values they decide to uphold. Rome made its choice. Now we must make ours.